Hi everybody, so here I am at home and what I'm going to do is a quick review for your test that is happening this week on Wednesday. So this is a screen capture program that I use for a lot of my online classes, but I thought it would be a helpful way to do the review for your unit test for this week as well. So, of course, right now you can see that we're on your FOL homepage, and this is the material right here that I will be going over. So, of course, that's looking at chapter 6 and 7 and that last little bit of chapter 4, pages 64 to 69. So I thought that we would just go through the material together, and if anyone's interested in doing the review, then you can just take a look at this before the test on Friday. All right, so let's start back at the beginning with the material on intelligence from chapter 6. So, of course, that week we started things off with our definition of intelligence. So the definitions are really good to know about for the test. Of course, the main definitions that you will have to remember will be the definition of intelligence, memory, substance abuse, and then last week we also looked at emotion and motivation. So, really good to know all of the definitions. And of course, our definition for intelligence has to do with our ability to acquire new knowledge, reason and solve problems, and to deal effectively with our environment. So it's this three-part definition that we're looking at. All right, so we started things off that week with a bit of a history lesson looking back at the work of Binet and Terman when they first started doing their work on measuring intelligence with children. And of course, what they did was they documented a child's mental age through some research that they had done and divided that by the child's chronological age. And that was how they came up with that intelligence quotient or IQ score. Then David Weschler took the work of Binet and Terman and modernized it a bit and brought it up to date with the North American school system. And he came up with these two tests, the WACE and the WISC. And he based this all on the concept of normal distribution based on this diagram here. All right, then we have Charles Spearman, of course, who was working at the same time as a lot of these other intelligence theorists, and he developed a concept called general intelligence, or the G factor, that he thought was a common concept that underlied all of our mental abilities. And then we switched gears in psychology a little bit and started to think a bit more complexly about the concept of emotion. And Robert Sternberg was really the first person that got us thinking a little bit differently. So he kept that traditional kind of definition of intelligence, but he also added practical and creative intelligence, talking about our ability to adapt and grow, and in addition to that, our ability to, come up with solutions to kind of practical everyday problems. Then, of course, we have Howard Gardner's theory, which divides it up much more. So make sure that you're familiar with all of these different types of intelligence that Howard Gardner talked about. Your textbook goes into it in a bit of detail. And then again, for those of you who have completed the quiz already this week from chapter 6, you would know that there were a couple questions that came up about this theory. So we also talked a little bit about social and emotional intelligence. Of course, on Howard Gardner's model, social intelligence would be interpersonal intelligence, and then emotional intelligence would be intrapersonal intelligence. So these two right over here. All right, so that's a very quick run through of the week 5 material on chapter 6 on intelligence. What I'm going to do now is just open up the material on memory. All right, so this is the other bit of material that your quiz this week is focusing on. So of course, the definition of memory is really important for everybody to be familiar with. And again, for those of you who have taken the quiz already, hopefully you would have gotten some sort of definition type questions. So of course, the process of memory is a 3-part process. The information first has to be encoded, and after it's been encoded, after we've changed that information into something that makes sense for our brain, and so again, thinking about sensory memory, for example, that's when the information is being encoded from that sensory to our short-term memory, and then of course it's stored in our long-term memory. And then the process of memory is such that we are then able to remember something or retrieve it. So the processes of memory is really these 3 components. When it comes to different types of memory, though, there are again 3 different components that we look at. So we've got sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So let's just revisit these 3 types of memory. So our sensory memory is, of course, those sensory experiences that we have in any given moment. This is how we go to remember something, and it's basically just when we're having a sensory experience. It could be that we're hearing something or seeing something. And of course, what happens is that our brains are able to hold on to that very quick piece of information. The 2 different types of sensory memory that we talked about in class were iconic and echoic. So iconic memory is the part of our sensory memory about visual stimuli, visual icons, for example. And our echoic memory is about auditory stimuli, how we first encounter auditory stimuli. All right, so the second type of memory that we talked about was short-term or working memory. And so, of course, what happens is we have a sensory experience, we hear something or see something, and then if our brain determines that it's important enough, it will move it to our short-term memory, or what we also call the working memory, where we can think about it and pay attention to it a bit. So this is the definition of short-term memory. Very important to know about this definition for the test. So it's the part of our memory where we consciously think about something, manipulate a piece of information, pay attention to something when we're aware of something. Generally lasts about 30 to 60 seconds, and rehearsal is one of the techniques that we can use to retain that information for longer periods of time, so that it can move from our short-term to our long-term memory. All right, so our long-term memories are very fascinating. We think for the most part that they're unlimited, and that many of the long-term memories we have are permanent. But keep in mind that when we remember something from our long-term memory, it's a reconstruction, right? So we have to kind of piece it back together. And we talked about some of the factors that can impact our memory, which we'll talk about again in just a moment. So our long-term memories, just like our sensory memories, are broken up into a couple different categories. We have our implicit and explicit memories. So let's just talk a little bit about the difference between these. Implicit memories are the ones that, well, they're implicit. We're not necessarily aware that we have them, but we do have them, right? They're also sometimes referred to as non-declarative, and procedural memories are a good example of an implicit long-term memory. You know that you know how to do it. We just don't always think about it, right? It's something that kind of comes like second nature, riding a bike, brushing your teeth, that kind of thing. Explicit memories, on the other hand, are the ones that we're consciously aware of. We can recall them, we can talk about them, and for that reason, they're also sometimes referred to as declarative memories because we can declare that these are memories that we have. Two types of explicit memories that we talked about in class: episodic and semantic. So our episodic memories are memories of episodes from our life. If you think about it kind of like an episode from a television show, these are events that have been experienced firsthand by us, like our graduation day or the birth of a baby or our wedding day, things like that, right? Also sometimes referred to as autobiographical memories. Semantic memories, on the other hand, are our memories for specific pieces of information or knowledge, not necessarily tied to a personal experience. So this is going to be, the factual information that would be required, for example, of a specific professional or something like that. So these are the three long-term memories that we talked about: procedural, semantic, and episodic. These two, semantic and episodic, would be considered explicit declarative memories because we're consciously aware that we have them. And then procedural memory is an example of implicit, or what we call non-declarative memory. All right, so that week we also talked a little bit about some of the factors that can impact how effective and accurate our long-term memories are. We talked about the role of biases and schemas. So let's revisit that concept of schemas. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in our next unit. Essentially, schemas are just ways of organizing and categorizing and understanding the world around us. Oftentimes, just to kind of make things easier for ourselves, we'll organize things into schemas. But what they do is they can also influence our perceptions of people, things that happen in our lives. And schemas are so powerful that they can even impact the way that we remember certain things. So important to think about that. We also know that eyewitness testimony, the accuracy of eyewitness testimony has been questioned in the past because, of course, sometimes our long-term memories are not as reliable as we would like them to be. And for that, we talked about the high-profile case of Cotton versus Poole, which you can read a little bit more about in your textbook. A few other factors that we talked about that can affect long-term memory are things like stress. An example is weapon focus. If there's a weapon present in a moment, someone might have a hard time remembering something. We also talk about source confusion and the misinformation effect. So just make sure that you're familiar with these three factors that can impact our long-term memory. Talked a bit about suspect lineups and the difference between simultaneous and sequential lineups. Your textbook goes into that a bit more too. Just make sure that you do spend a bit of time reviewing the concepts of amnesia and that you know the difference between anterograde and retrograde amnesia. That anterograde amnesia is the form of memory loss where a person is unable to remember things after the physical trauma. Everything from before is okay, but after the trauma occurs. And then retrograde amnesia is the kind of classic example of amnesia that most people think of when they think of that concept, that a person can't remember things that happened from before the accident. We also talked a little bit about the neural explanation for memory and the concept of long-term potentiation, that when neurons are fired together, they start to become more efficient, which helps to strengthen our memory. All right, so that's where we will end this first video on Chapter 6, which looked at memory and intelligence. I'm going to start a second video for you in just a moment about chapter 7 and 4.